So wolves are back in Colorado, but the story isn't so simple. In this episode of Our Wild Lives, we sit down with Dr. Brenna Cassidy, Wolf Monitoring and Data Coordinator, and Eric Odell, Wolf Conservation Program Manager at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department. Together, they unpack the complex journey of wolf reintroduction in Colorado, from historical extirpation to today's restoration efforts. We talk about the role of public opinion and legislation in shaping wildlife policy, and dive into the realities of wolf livestock conflicts, management strategies, and the values and science that guide it all. You'll also hear behind-the-scenes stories from the field and some of the key things to do when navigating conflict in conservation. Welcome to today's episode of Our Wild Lives. We are in Fort Collins, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Colorado wolf reintroduction. I'm Katie Perkins.
And I'm Ed Arnett, co-host of the Our Wild Lives podcast. It's great to have you guys and really look forward to our conversation.
Can you give us a brief overview of wolves in Colorado?
Yeah, so the story of wolves in Colorado is certainly a long one and an interesting one for sure. But to put it kind of briefly, historically, wolves were everywhere in Colorado. They covered east to west, north to south. Every county had wolves historically. And through all of the predator control work that was done in the early 1900s, the wolves were ultimately extirpated. No more wolves were in the state. The last time we had wolves was in the 1940s or so. There was reintroductions that happened outside of the state in Yellowstone, in central Idaho in the mid-90s. And Colorado maintained no wolf populations, no known wolves, quite a while until those populations in the Northern Rockies really started to kind of take off, do well there. And so after those reintroductions in the 1990s, we started to see individual wolves coming down into the state from time to time. None of them lasted very long in the state, and then some of them were monitored, collared, and some were not. Some we found out about only because they were hit on roads and
there was one killed on I-70, right? A
and
collared female.
So all of these things were happening in the larger lower 48 parts of the country. And so at that time, wolves were managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're federally listed. And so there were these things called the distinct population segments, these different geographic areas where wolves were managed. And each DPS, distinct population segment, was managed differently. In Colorado, I-70 is the major interstate east-west. And to the north of I-70 was one DPS, and to the south was another DPS. And so there was some expectation that there might be a delisting of wolves in that northern DPS. And so at that time, the Colorado Division of Wildlife at the time, convened a working group that was going to describe how wolves would be managed in the state as they migrated into the state. There was no reintroduction discussion about it, but it's, if wolves are delisted and management authority then comes back to the state, how are we going to deal with this as wolves naturally continue this migration and ultimately potential establishment in the state? And so this group put these recommendations together for how wolves will be managed. That was finalized, approved in 2004. We never really had a population of wolves become established in the state. And then the whole DPS issue became a non-issue, and wolves were then listed throughout the country with the exception of Mexican wolves and red wolves. That doesn't really pertain to Colorado. So all of this time is going on, and there's these ways that wolves could be managed, and we're seeing some natural migration, but not a whole lot of it. So then a group put together a petition beginning in 2019, starting to collect signatures. In Colorado, you can do that. You can collect signatures on a petition to get an issue put on the statewide ballot. So that started the summer of 2019. That was not a Colorado Parks and Wildlife-led effort. It was outside. That was citizen-driven. And ultimately, they got enough signatures on their petitions to put it on the ballot in November of 2020, and it passed. That ballot initiative, a statewide ballot initiative, passed narrowly, but it still passed, and that created state law, and that really directed our whole efforts from that point forward to develop a wolf plan, to develop protocols for how we're going to reintroduce wolves, how we're going to manage wolves, how we're going to compensate for livestock losses and things like that. So there's a long story to it. That's kind of the nutshell of how we got to where we are.
It's interesting, Colorado, having lived in Oregon, you were taking a similar path of Oregon, Colorado was in planning for their immigration to the state, basically. But then the proposition for 114 came along. So how did the public opinion influence that? I mean, it seems to me like the public was being informed on wolf reintroduction. They were being informed on ecological benefits. Parks and Wildlife really couldn't lobby against it, right? There were a number of NGOs that were against this, of course, and the ranching community and others, but that public opinion was swayed a little bit in favor of the reintroduction, of course.
It was a really interesting time because as a state agency, when there is an issue on a statewide ballot, we're simply prohibited from taking positions. Yeah. And so CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we certainly didn't take a position on the proposition, it was 114, or really do much in advocating one way or the other for or against wolf reintroduction. We just simply couldn't say much about that just based on state law. And so a lot of that was with the way public opinion was formed on that was the general advertising. And there was a lot of advertising, both sides, for and against wolf reintroduction. We saw billboards all around the state on highways, with all kinds of imagery that you might imagine of either wolves are great or wolves are terrible. And so I think that's one of the key takeaways from wolf management. And as wildlife agents, we do all kinds of restoration of all different kinds of species. For wolves, it's not that different biologically from all of the other aspects that we've done, lynx reintroduction, black-footed ferrets, all of these other things. But socially and politically, it's a totally different issue. And so that public opinion drives a lot in the way wolf restoration happened and now how wolf management's happening.
There's like a social carrying capacity relative to the habitat carrying capacity. We as biologists all know what habitat carrying capacity looks like, but that social carrying capacity is really critical in all of this because there is a threshold that is well below the habitat carrying capacity in terms of how many wolves will be socially accepted in the state.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Colorado's perfectly suited in a lot of ways for wolves. We've got huge ungulate populations. We've got lots of public lands. We've got lots of good areas from a very general biological perspective of what makes good wolf habitat. They're habitat generalists, so there's nothing particularly specific that they need. But you're right, the social carrying capacity is very much lower than whatever they could maintain as a biologically self-regulating.
Well, that public opinion drove the Proposition 114, but it's also driving some current things that are happening now legislatively and such. So that it's starting to play out live here in Colorado on that social acceptance. So
during that whole time, too, I was not with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I'm fairly new to the agency. But watching from a distance and watching, the summer leading up to that vote, having a couple of these wolves that naturally immigrated into Colorado who bred and had pups, I was viewing it from a far distance. I was sitting in Montana watching with fascination this entire thing play out. And there seemed to be here's this little taste of what it's like living with wolves in one small area, one group of wolves. I'm continually fascinated how that entire situation played out with these naturally immigrating wolves breeding while also this ballot initiative was gaining signatures and actually getting on the ballot just a couple months later. What kind of cosmic alignment was that all happened at the same time?
Yeah. And especially given the politics in the neighboring state and the management strategies there, if they step across the border, they're in serious jeopardy.
Yeah.
And protected on this side of Colorado.
Right. Brenna, I think this is a great one for you because you were telling us how you've worked with a few different distinct populations of wolves. So what makes the Colorado wolf reintroduction different from previous efforts in other places?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that we can kind of point to right away that we've identified already. This was spurred by Proposition 114 and was a vote, and there's plenty of public opinion there. In previous translocation efforts in the lower 48, at least, that was not led by a vote. That was led by a federal agency or a state agency, so there's some major differences there. Colorado is, we're looking at a statewide perspective. And when we look at something like Yellowstone, that was, a much tighter area and it was a national park. So the goals and the mission statements of the National Park Service and a state agency are fairly different. So looking at the two different perspectives there, I think is really interesting. On more of a biological level, one thing that I've noticed living in Colorado just for a year and a half or so, coming from some history in Yellowstone in particular, is Colorado is a dramatic landscape. I mean, there are deserts, high alpine peaks. Like there are so many different ecotypes in this state that I'm absolutely fascinated watching wolves move around and go places that I not necessarily am completely surprised by, but it's pretty incredible. I mean, wolves above 13,000 feet, wolves moving through desert that I, didn't necessarily think was amazing wolf habitat, and coming from somewhere like Yellowstone, which is a little bit less dramatic. It's pretty fascinating looking at a couple of those kind of biological differences. And also, we're just a little bit further away from these bigger populations that in the 80s and into the early 90s, before wolf reintroduction in central Idaho and Yellowstone, wolves were recolonizing northwestern Montana. And there was a huge debate of whether wolf reintroduction in those areas was necessary or not. Ultimately, it happened, but those populations are all connected now. And when we look at Colorado, we're looking at the future and thinking, oh, are we going to be connected or not? And thinking about those considerations for our founding population to make sure we have a big enough and diverse enough founding population.
Mm-hmm. And talking about watching where these wolves are going, is that part of your work? You've got collars on them and you're reading through all this data of where they're going. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Yeah. So I am the monitoring coordinator and data coordinator. So collecting all that data, watching where are wolves going? Are they forming packs? Which ones are surviving? Which ones are dying? Which ones are pairing and reproducing? So, it's a pretty exciting time. We're in early summer of 2025 and we're starting to get pup counts on the 4 dens that we're monitoring. We also have had several mortalities this spring, but, as we know, those two things are what balances a population, including immigration and emigration as well. We just don't see as much of that in Colorado as, because we're not closely connected to another wolf population.
Right.
The literature's kind of played up a good bit of the science behind ecological benefits of having wolf populations, Yellowstone being the ultimate science playground for that. My understanding is some of that's maybe a little misleading or can be misleading, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what the expected benefits are. I know what I've heard from folks that supported Proposition 114, and I've read the literature, but I've also read the literature that doesn't necessarily support them being a keystone predator. So let's talk through that just a little bit about what the expectations are here, and especially given the dynamics that you see in this state that you've described. We have deserts, we have the high plains, we have mountains. They're up at 13,000 feet. You got all that to contend with. They're going to have different ecological effects.
Yeah,
different systems.
Absolutely. Wolves are often, I think, throughout history, these larger than life animals. I mean, whether we're thinking about Little Red Riding Hood or the fact that, wolves are saving rivers or changing rivers or something, they're often seen as these just incredibly larger than life species, really. So thinking about what we call a trophic cascade, thinking about wolves being these keystone predators that when they're in or on a landscape, they're going to change everything and that affect cascades throughout the entire ecosystem. There's been so much interesting research out of Yellowstone, out of Banff National Park, out of other places that is building upon the question of, are wolves causing these trophic cascades? Huge debates. But when I look at that research and when I look at the landscape in Yellowstone, I started there in 2009, just finished my PhD up. So saw a lot of change go on throughout that ecosystem. And when I see it, I see a really heterogeneous landscape. And I see areas that are being affected, willow riparian areas being affected by something. And some of these areas are recovering, and then they might be grazed down the next year. Mm-hmm. Yellowstone in particular is an incredibly complicated ecosystem. So teasing out what is an effect of wolves, what's an effect of a different, elk population, bison population, changing climate
impacts. Exactly. I was thinking
climate
the same
impacts.
thing.
Yellowstone just had a major flood 2 or 3 years ago that completely changed several of those rivers. So, when we're looking at that, we can see changes. It's tough to assign all of those changes to wolves, really. So when I am looking at the landscape in Colorado, we're outside of a national park. We have national parks in the state, but we're looking at a statewide level. I'm looking at it and I'm looking at all of the other things that are affecting the landscape of Colorado. And, like we talked about before, there are so many different areas. But if we concentrate on where the debate is around riparian areas, I'm looking in Colorado and I'm seeing climate change effects, places being developed, human impacts on those areas, huge demands for water just to have humans exist. And I have a really hard time thinking about wolves completely changing rivers in Colorado. So that's not to say that wolves don't have an effect on their ecosystems. They absolutely do. I think what we're looking at in Colorado for, whether we see a trophic cascade or not, I think that's going to be really hard to tease out with all the other things that are going on here.
Yeah, agree with that too. I mean, we're outside of national parks. I think when you take that piece away, and the other piece of it is time and numbers, right? I mean, we're 2 or 3 years into wolf restoration with 20, 30 animals on the ground, right?
It's anything,
or decades, maybe even. Yeah, it's a long time away from that. And the story about wolves changing rivers is a very romantic one and a very simplified one. And I think actually people do a disservice to the idea of wolf restoration by trying to give wolves that much credit. I think that there's a lot of reasons to restore wolves other than restoring ecosystems. Yeah. Wolves are a native species to the state. As a state wildlife agency, that's one of our primary goals and primary pieces of our mission is to restore wildlife, not to portray a story that may or may not actually be true. Right. So I think that that's a really important piece.
I agree. Yeah. I went to Yellowstone for the first time. Well, it's 1975, but I don't remember a damn thing other than a bear crawling in the back of my grandpa's truck trying to get our cooler. I remember a lot more than that, but I don't remember anything about elk numbers and that kind of thing. Yeah. I darn sure noticed it when I went in '83 when I was an emerging wildlife student at Montana State, and I can assure you elk were way overpopulated on the winter ranges for sure all around Yellowstone. So that was just an obvious observation. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist or have a whole lot of data to come to that realization. Just look at the ground and the range. And obviously not only reducing the numbers, but redistributing the animals across the landscape, you're going to see those vegetative impacts. But wolves are just one of many agents of change, is kind of what I heard.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and even in the northern range of Yellowstone, it's not just wolves that have changed the ungulate populations, right? There are lots of other things that are happening there.
Yeah, major mountain lion recovery, grizzly bear recovery, and, at the same time as wolf restoration in that area, we had differences in hunting pressure right outside the park on that northern range elk herd, major drought. I think sometimes people forget the 88 fires, like that whole story and in the elk story in Yellowstone. So I view wolf restoration kind of like Eric said, like there's so many different reasons to restore a species, not just wolves, that there's the scientific side, this very technical side of what do wolves do in an ecosystem. There's also a very philosophical side of what is the value of rewilding, what is the value of a species being on the landscape in that intrinsic value.
Yep.
So you both have probably experiences with wolves that most of us will never get to have. So could you tell us a little bit about what it's actually like working with wolves out in the field, capturing them, putting collars on them? Tell us some stories about that.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with the first time I came into contact with wolves. And it was what Brenna alluded to early on. As the whole petition gathering is happening, we're having wolves naturally migrate into the state. And so we had a black wolf that came in. We got a photo of it turned into us by the public. And then following her, she had a collar on, talked with our colleagues in Wyoming, got the information there. And then as we're monitoring her, noticed her with another animal, a gray animal. So it was in February 2021, that we captured that animal and put a collar on him. And that was the first time that the state agency, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, had collared a wolf. And so leaving the helicopter, coming up to that animal and just seeing it for the first time after it had been sedated was a pretty amazing kind of a thing. And so it's the first time you're hands-on with an animal. You're maneuvering it, measuring it, putting a collar on it, making sure that health is good, and it turned out to be a male. Those two ended up breeding and had the first litter of pups that we had ever had. And so that, as a first experience into wolves, that was a pretty remarkable kind of a thing to experience. And of course, we've had lots of other opportunities to be hands-on. A lot of wolf management is not hands-on. It's a lot of it is monitoring from afar. But because we're in the midst of this really active restoration piece, there is a lot of wolf handling. But that first experience was something I'll never forget.
My first wolf job was I was a technician for a master's student, Dr. Matt Metz, in Yellowstone. I was 19 years old. I was a wildlife ecology major with University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And I thought, what a wild opportunity. Like, I'm probably never going to work with wolves again. So I might as well really enjoy and learn everything I can this summer. And, one of my first days for that job was we were generally searching GPS clusters. So we weren't seeing wolves a whole lot, but we helped monitor a couple dens and tried to get pup counts. So we went out super early one morning and we got to watch this den from 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. And that's my favorite stuff. Scopes have improved in the last 16 years, but just watching wolves do wolf things, they don't have no idea we're there a couple miles away watching. So to be able to see that and then be able to be part of this capture and translocation effort, you have a huge responsibility to make sure that wolf is well cared for and to make sure that you give it the best care possible. So having a wolf in hand it's pretty heavy, like a heavy feeling to make sure that wolf is able to go out after you release it in this brand new home to be able to go do wolf things again. So it's really nice to be able to see the wolves that we captured and translocated out there just doing what they naturally do. Did a flight the other day, saw a couple of the wolves that we translocated this last year traveling around. One male was bringing food back to a rendezvous site, big belly full of food. And it was really nice to just see him, doing wolf things after we had handled him so recently.
Mm-hmm. You say that you were there that summer and you were never going to deal with wolves again. What happened? What hooked you? Why are you still there? Yeah, 16 years later. I had that job and I was like, this was absolutely incredible. I ended up going back that next summer and worked for the Yellowstone Bird Program. Then things somehow worked out. Graduated with my bachelor's, moved out, worked with raptors in Yellowstone, worked with mountain lions in Yellowstone, and then kind of got in this cycle of working with the bird program in the summer and the wolf program in the winter. So the busy season for both taxa. Worked with really incredible people, got, really incredible experience doing that. I guess I got bit by the bug a little bit. Yeah.
I think when you lock yourself into an idea that I want to be this, you're going to get thrown a gyro ball or something. It's just like, and you go where the opportunity lands. You just do in our profession.
Well, that's kind of one of my takeaways because I don't have a history of having a whole lot of wolf experience. I've been involved with some wolf issues throughout my career here at CPW, but I get asked that a lot, like people that are aspiring students that want to become a wildlife biologist, that want to become fundamentally a wolf biologist. And I said, my path was not that way at all. I started out as an undergraduate. My undergraduate thesis was on pollination ecology, watching bumblebees and flowers and that kind of stuff. stuff. And so I think that, to me, that was kind of one of my big takeaways is don't say no. Say yes to everything. And any opportunity that comes your way can turn out to be a very interesting path. And
that's extraordinarily sage advice because, you think about it being a generalist versus a specialist, and the wolf is an ultimate generalist, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely.
I mean, they can live anywhere on about anything. And so I think all biologists that enter into this profession, if they think and some do follow that linear path for sure, their entire career.
Yeah, and the body of knowledge that's able to develop and is great. I mean, we need people that are the specialists that do that, but it's not necessarily.
But you don't have to start as your technician job and follow that all the way through being a specialist.
I didn't take kind of like a normal route that a wildlife technician takes of being in one place for 6 months or a year and then going to another species in another location and doing something else. I really was lucky enough to be immersed in Yellowstone National Park, which is still wild to me. Yeah. But being able to see that even one location through several different species' eyes.
Yeah, that's really unique.
Very unique. Being able to see that landscape through the eyes of mountain lions and then golden eagles and look. Actually, they use this landscape very similarly. Yeah. And to look, through the eyes of common loons and wolves was very, very interesting. So I, definitely felt lucky to be able to do that. And wolves being the ultimate generalist, they're also incredibly resilient. So trying to have a little bit of a generalist background while diving into wolf ecology and, graduate school being wolf ecology, but also having that resiliency to stick with it or, do something else if that's needed.
Yeah.
Let's dig in a little deeper on some of the kind of ecological interactions here in Colorado. I realize it's early in the game, but wolves got to eat. A lot, and so they're already interacting with our ungulate populations. We'll get into interactions with livestock and such later, but how are you? What are you seeing early on here with their interactions with our ungulate populations? But also, is anyone kind of looking at some of the effects on the other predators in the state? How's that playing out?
Yeah, I mean. Starting with the other carnivores in Colorado, when I think of some of the major ones, I think of, black bears, mountain lions, coyotes. So we have actually already seen one wolf killed by a mountain lion. It was our first one last April. And to me, that's very interesting because I had never seen that before. And, a lot of my graduate work was on wolf cause-specific mortality. Yeah. So having never seen it, it was very interesting because the dynamics in Colorado right now are such that, we have some formed packs now, we have some dens now, but at that point, we had a lot of individual wolves wandering around, looking at the landscape. They just got here. So when I saw that, and we reached out to some of our counterparts in other states to ask, hey, have you guys seen this? Washington was an example. They had seen it several times.
Lions killed wolves.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely competitors.
Yeah, and it really comes down to, I think, these wolves not being in groups, because one-on-one, I think a mountain lion's going to win every time. But when we get
I would have predicted that too.
Right?
Not being a predator ecologist, but that would have been my prediction.
It makes complete sense.
It does.
But then when we get into, groups of wolves that are 3, 4, 5 plus, then the equation changes. Yeah. So when I'm out here looking at, okay, we have a lot of single wolves wandering around. There's a lot of mountain lions in Colorado, and they're vulnerable to that type of interspecific predation, really. So that has been fascinating to look at. We don't have many examples of black bears interacting with wolves at this point. We get black bears on cameras that we've set out for wolves, and anecdotally, I've talked to some people who have, a wolf presence in their area, and they're noticing, oh, here we have what seems like less coyotes in this area. And that's what we've seen play out in other areas. Wolves and coyotes are competitors, and wolves are often going to win that fight. So But then, one step further, do we see more foxes in that area? Because foxes and coyotes.
That's always been my curiosity about that mesocarnivore interactions.
Yeah. So we have a couple of those interactions that, some anecdotal, some we've seen direct mortality for wolves. So yeah, we would like to see some more packs of wolves for multiple reasons, but one of them is to kind of navigate this landscape that has a lot of mountain lions on it.
So what about our ungulate populations? Eric, what are you seeing there?
So, like I said, we're way early into this, and we don't have the numbers or the time in here to see any kind of effect. They're certainly predating on ungulates. We've got all of these individual animals roaming around and not a pack defending a territory and really kind of establishing themselves in a particular
That's when we'll really start seeing it.
And that's when we may start to see things that are, much more clear in terms of some impacts, or those results may not be quite as clear too because of all of the different effects on the landscape. And so, there's certainly, wolves are carnivores that we certainly expect them to eat meat. That's what wolves do. But it's early to say how it's going to affect our ungulate populations in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were watching a drainage that a den was in just a couple weeks ago, and I've seen this over and over. There were cow elk in that drainage. This was right before calving, so they all still looked pregnant to me, but the den was not even a mile away. Those wolves have been there for 6 weeks, and yet there's still elk using that drainage just as they would before. So it's, the effects of wolves on ungulates, particularly elk, I look at as like the numeric effect of how many elk are wolves killing and that behavioral effect. Are they moving to different areas? Are they avoiding riparian areas? And, we've seen research out of Utah State and Yellowstone that showed elk might change their patterns of going into those riskier areas, those willow areas, for a couple hours a day. But in general, they're not completely avoiding those areas, which kind of ties back to our trophic cascades question and gets back in there. So it is fascinating to me, having watched wolf dens over the years and watched elk use those areas, even though they know wolves are there. Like I've seen them pick up their head and look at a wolf walking across, a sage hillside. Like, that there's a den there, but for some reason you're okay with it. So they have some sort of communication we just can't possibly understand.
I talked to the hunting community a good bit, and of course there's obvious concern about competition for
sure.
Big bull elk and deer and that kind of thing. But an interesting angle on this, I was talking with an outfitter last year, and her concern was the fact that if the elk redistribute because of a pack of wolves, I'm out of business. Outfitters get a permit for a very specific location in the landscape here, anywhere probably in all states. But here in Colorado, that's how it works, right? You get a permit for an area. And if a pack happens to have that behavioral influence on a herd, the elk redistribute to private land, for example, where they may feel safer. So it's just an interesting angle. It's not just the killing of the numbers of elk, but it can be the redistribution that is a concern to the hunting community.
It may push them out of areas. It may push them into areas,
It could push them in,
It
exactly.
could be opportunistic. It could be beneficial, too.
Yeah. So a lot of speculation with not a lot of things manifesting
Time will
just
tell.
yet.
And that's part of it too, is that we've got a really good program to monitor wolves and to see what's going to happen. So we've got very intentional efforts to keep collars on animals, to keep collars on packs at least, and to kind of monitor that through time and see where wolves are going to ultimately settle. And we'll have a much more detailed story to tell in 10 years, 15 years. But for the time being, we're doing the best to keep track of all the animals that we've put on the landscape.
Yep.
So wolves have kind of become this symbol of tension between more urban areas and more rural areas. As wildlife biologists, how are you navigating that conflict? How are you having these conversations with these two people and try to help them see a little more eye to eye?
Yeah, that's the key piece of wolf management. Really all wildlife management is people management. And that's not something that we're necessarily all that well trained or equipped to do. A lot of that is learning on the job, learning how to interface with the rancher or the wolf advocate or whomever. And you're right, too. I mean, when the initiative was on the ballot and it passed, the vast majority of Colorado's population is on the urban Front Range, from Fort Collins down to Colorado Springs. And that's really where a lot of that vote was carried, right? That's where the vast majority of the population is. And part of the ballot initiative said that wolves would be reintroduced west of the Continental Divide. Mm-hmm. So those that are on the west slope, which is largely our more rural, more agricultural producing communities, particularly in the ranching side of things, definitely feel a rural-urban divide. And I can empathize with that. I can understand why they have that sentiment. And so it's a very, very challenging situation to deal with. And by and large, not to say that all of western slope of Colorado was opposed to wolf reintroduction. The counties generally voted against it, but there are pockets of support. And there's no county that voted 100% against wolf reintroduction. And so there are always these issues. You don't really know who you're going to talk to and what people's perceptions are on wolves when you go to talk to them. And so making generalizations that all ranchers hate wolves is not a fair assessment. That's not the fact. We've met many ranchers that are actually in favor of outfitters as well. People like the idea of hunting in an environment that has the full suite or at least a more full suite of the predators that were historically here in Colorado. So it's a really challenging thing. One of the things that's different about this than other reintroduction efforts is that this was not, as I said earlier, not a CPW-led effort. And so when we go to those communities and we say, we understand you may not be fully in support or fully in favor of wolf restoration. This is state law. As state employees, this is what we're doing. We're implementing state law, which is what the ballot initiative came. And so that doesn't necessarily buy a whole lot of sympathy. People still don't like wolves. Those that don't like wolves still don't like wolves. But maybe that helps us in some ways in some of those conversations. But really, those conversations are all about listening and trying to understand. We're not going to convince people that really are opposed to wolves that they should be in favor of wolves. That's not our intent at all. It's to understand what their concerns are, see what the resources are that we can have, and how we can try to make things as positive as possible for both the wolves and for the citizens of the state.
Let's talk a little bit about the non-lethal methods that are being used now to help, with ranchers and to keep wolves away from their livestock. If they're working, are you guys doing any work on that? Or I know there's some work at Colorado State University.
Yeah.
How do we see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, so we know what we said all along, wherever wolves and livestock share the landscape, there's going to be conflict, right? We're going to have wolves who are a carnivore, a depredator, a predator. There's going to be depredation issues with wolves and livestock. And part of the ballot initiative said that we had to develop programs to try to resolve that or minimize those kinds of things. We're never going to prevent it. And so, a lot of ways that we try to do that is by implementing these non-lethal tools. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of things that are pretty new in some ways and some that are well tested in other states as well. Things like fladry, which is a fence line that has these red flags on it and sometimes electrified. It works for a period of time. It's not a long-term kind of a solution to the issue. It gets deployed at the right times of the year in small landscapes and calving pastures, and lambing pastures, things like that, where it's a small contained area. And that will generally keep wolves out of the area. We use cameras to kind of monitor what wolf behavior is as they come into contact with that fladry. Noisemakers, sounds, lights, all these different kinds of things, but you're using novel tools to try to scare them out of that system. Also, human presence is a really big deal. And so we've worked with Colorado Department of Ag, CDA, to implement a range riding program. And so we've got range riders that are out spending a lot of time with the livestock. They're not necessarily wolf biologists. They're not wolf biologists, but they're more attuned to the livestock and looking at livestock behavior, looking at livestock health and seeing if there are ways to try to change some of those behaviors and try to keep conflict minimized to the greatest extent possible. And so all of these things cumulatively add up. And if we can find ways to use the right tool in the right circumstance, hopefully that helps to address a lot of those concerns that we have.
My understanding from talking to wolf biologists in the 3 states that hunt is that they're barely scratching 20% of the estimated population in those hunts. But is there a behavioral difference? And I realize Colorado's very different. It's remote, but it's also far more urban than those 3 states and where those wolves are. So how have those dynamics kind of played out, or have they?
Yeah, it's interesting because we think about hunting and, trapping, where trapping is allowed in some of these states, as, this is a major cause of wolf mortality. So not as much the behavior yet as you're talking about. But when I think about wolf mortality, and think about hunting, there are a lot of wolves that are harvested. But then if we look at when wolves were not hunted, say in the tri-state area of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, before they were delisted, so pre-2009, still the vast majority of wolf mortality was caused by humans. So this is, and I'm
vehicles,
talking,
I assume, and
control actions for livestock depredations, some poaching, but up there from I think the late 80s until 2004 or so, they showed that natural mortality was only about 12% of mortality.
And I bet that was dominated by wolves themselves.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So, when you look somewhere that is highly protected, like a Yellowstone or something, you do see that number go down, whether they're, protected or not at that time. But when I think about mortality, at first I'm like, oh, hunting would, cause a lot of mortality. But then you look actually like, even when there's no hunting season, humans cause a lot of mortality. We have major roads. We do have, lethal removal either by the agency or, caught in the act type of lethal removal for wolves in Colorado. Like that is legal. So when we're thinking about the mortality part, we do actually see a lot of human-caused mortality in places where there's no hunting even. So thinking more about the behavioral side, wolves are generally pretty cryptic. I feel like, there's an attitude where people think maybe they're not because there are a couple places, in the U.S. where wolves are pretty visible. But, all of those boundaries are kind of meaningless to wolves. They are using, national parks, they're using states, they're using this state and this state. So a lot of those jurisdictions do change and they keep existing no matter what jurisdiction they're in, whether they're subject to harvest or not. So we'll see what happens. I don't know if we'll see, major behavioral changes because the wolves in Colorado are, still subject to hazing when they're around livestock. So they're learning that, this is not a place that they should be. They can still be lethally removed if they're chasing cattle or something like that. So they are still subject to some negative experiences with humans. So, and when they're subject to a negative experience like hazing, that's a learning opportunity. Whereas if they were harvested, there's no more learning after
the learning
that.
stops.
So we'll see. I'm super interested, coming from a different type of experience, being, more readily available to observe wolves in Yellowstone usually. It'll be interesting the way that wolves exist in Colorado.
What's one piece of advice that you would give maybe students about to enter the field or someone navigating this conflict around conservation for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is to listen. I think, try to listen to understand and try to understand what where people's perspectives are, why they have the opinions that they do. Don't try to convince them otherwise, and just to listen, to understand, and to try to see what kinds of solutions you can formulate together, and not to come into a situation thinking that you have the answers to all of those challenges, because there's a lot of challenges, and every situation is different. Every producer's operation is different. Everybody has different pressures, different kinds of concerns that they have to address and balance. And so the social side of conflict management, whether it's wolves or bears or mountain lions or elk or ravens or whatever, it's all challenging, and everybody has a different perspective. And so understanding what those are and taking the time to listen and ask good questions is really a key skill.
Definitely.
Yeah, I absolutely echo all of that. Listening is going to be your best friend. I often dive a little bit too deep into nuance, and I want to know the facts and everything. And honestly, sometimes it doesn't matter. Listening to what people want and what they're feeling and what their experience is, whether it's with wolves or whatever, is probably going to be vastly different than my experience. And trying to understand each other is going to be the most important thing. And also, I would say that I have found the relationships that I built even, in undergrad or right after mid-20s, early 20s, have persisted and, until now, and have been really wonderful to be able to have those relationships with people, whether it's, other biologists or producers out there, being able to call someone and say, hey, I have a question about range riders. I don't know who to ask. You have range riders on your land. Can I ask you some naive questions? Has been really helpful. So, relationships are kind of what drives just humans as a species, but as far as career goes and as far as this major conflict, your relationships are going to be your best friend.
I really think this is a critical point for all of our listeners on this, but especially emerging professionals, students, to really pay attention to what these folks are saying, because we often don't know what we don't know. And you don't know what the landowner is thinking and feeling about their losses or the amount of time they have to put into something. And what you're suggesting to me is you're integrating them into the solution. You're asking questions, trying to help understand what they're going through to help develop a solution. And I think that listening piece to understand is critically important. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it up with one last question, just for a broader public. If either of you are in the airport and start talking about what you're doing and you're talking to somebody from Orlando or Los Angeles, why should they care about wolf reintroduction in Colorado?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's fun. You talk to friends and family that are totally not in the wildlife profession or not in the natural resource profession. And there's a lot of questions. Why do this? Why put yourself through this? Why put the state through this? And I think that it kind of comes back to this is what the agency does. We manage wildlife. This is part of restoring the system. This is addressing issues that humans had an impact on wolf populations and all kinds of predator populations 100 years ago, 80 years ago. And so now we're working to address a lot of those kinds of things. And it's the right thing to do, and from the restoration perspective.
Yeah, I'll kind of go back to something I said earlier. Wildlife restoration, rewilding in general is both a scientific and a philosophical question. When we get down to, specifically wolves have such an incredible amount of lore behind them. We have had such a history with this species in particular that I think it's very normal to be fascinated by them. It's very normal to have some big emotions tied to them, whether that's positive or negative, or what I seem to find more often is a mix of both, really. Yeah. So, I can't tell someone why they should care, but I think if we look a little deeper into our human history, we can see this fascination. And this is kind of just another step in the history of wolves and humans.
I always try to come back to, I enter into those situations where you get that question that most biologists aren't quite ready to answer. Yeah, it's like, well, why should I care about your greater sage grouse work or working with salamanders? I always try to come back to healthy ecosystems. If we have the entire complement of large predators, all the ungulate species, all of the various other species, we've done the environment a good thing. And that is going to manifest in clean air, clean water, wild landscapes, places where people can recreate. So try to tie it back into something that they can care about, and wolves are just another part of that, of a healthy ecosystem.
And I think a really important part of wolf restoration is coming back to that conflict and making sure that we want to maintain wolf populations on the landscape in the state, but we also want to maintain ranching. That's part of the heritage of the state as well. And so we have to work to find those solutions, to find out the ways that ranchers can continue to do the good work that they do and support wolf populations and elk populations and all of those other things too. And so it's not just about restoring wolves, but it's about restoring wolves in the context of all of Colorado, western and eastern and front range and urban and rural all together.
Yeah. And those private lands, those ranches are providing incredible wildlife habitat to not only wolves, but all other species. So we value them to such an incredible degree for the services and for the stewardship that those private lands are providing.
Yep. I know there's, Some people view it as a complete conflict or an adversarial, but I view this as an enormous conservation success that has its conflicts.
Exactly.
To make it a success. But I think this is a huge success and really appreciate you guys joining us and telling us the story. We may have to come back 10 years and see how things manifested that we talked about. But we've been talking with Brenna Cassidy and Eric Odell with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks to both of you.
Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us on the Our Wild Lives podcast. If you're ready to dive deeper into wildlife science, explore new career paths, or grow your personal network, visit us at wildlife.org. Follow at the Wildlife Society on social media and subscribe wherever you listen so you never miss out on a new episode. We'll catch you next week with more stories from the wild.